"You're not even in the same league as my mother?" Olivia said it with a smile, not loud, not dramatic, just clear enough for everyone at the table to hear. My son went quiet. The candles flickered. And I folded my napkin slowly before I answered. "If you've ever been dismissed in your own home, stay with me, because what happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't messy, but it changed everything. My name is Margaret Mara Ellison. I'm 72 years old. I'm a retired corporate compliance officer. I spent 34 years making sure companies didn't collapse under their own lies. I learned one rule early. When people talk too confidently, they're usually hiding numbers you haven't seen yet. I believed my son wasn't one of those people. I was wrong. It started 8 months earlier. Chris showed up at my townhouse on a Thursday evening just before sunset. His suit jacket was wrinkled. His tie hung loose. His voice carried that tight edge men use when they don't want to look weak. "Mom, I need a little breathing room." Breathing room, that's what he called it. He said a commercial deal had stalled. Cash flow was tight. His bonus structure had been restructured. Temporary setback, just until the next quarter closed. I listened. I always listen first. That's what compliance teaches you. He didn't ask for money directly. He circled it. "We're just stretched thin right now. Olivia's brand partnerships are slow. The condo association fees jumped." Eventually, he said it. "Could you help with the mortgage for a few months? Just until things stabilize." The mortgage. On the Buckhead condo with the floor-to-ceiling windows and marble countertops. The condo he told everyone he purchased as an investment property. I asked one question. "How much?" $3,200 a month. He looked embarrassed. I looked calm. I told him I'd think about it. That night, I opened my files. Richard taught me never to make decisions without reviewing structure. My late husband didn't believe in emotional finance. He believed in layers, trusts within trusts, contingencies, safeguards. "Never transfer power without documentation," he used to say. By morning, I agreed to help, but not the way Chris thought. For 7 months, I transferred $3,200 on the first of every month. Clean. On time, quiet. Olivia never thanked me. She never mentioned it. She did, however, post photos from Napa, from Aspen, from a rooftop tasting event downtown. Designer handbags appeared. A new Range Rover appeared. A custom walk-in closet renovation appeared. Breathing room looked expensive. I didn't confront, I observed, because silence gathers evidence. Then came the dinner. Olivia insisted on hosting it at the condo. "We want to celebrate growth," she said. Growth, interesting word. The dining room was staged like a magazine shoot. White orchids, gold flatware, catered seafood towers. A photographer friend capturing candid moments. I wore a navy dress I've owned for years. Olivia wore confidence like armor. Midway through dessert, she turned the conversation toward legacy. "My mother believes in evolution," she said. "She says if you're not scaling, you're shrinking." She looked directly at me. "Some people just stay comfortable." Chris shifted in his seat. I sipped my water, she continued. "My mom built clinics from scratch. She reinvented herself 3 times. I just think, well, not everyone operates at that level." There it was, polite cruelty, measured comparison, designed to reduce without appearing rude. Then she said it, "You're not even in the same league as my mother." Silence fell. And here's the thing about silence, most people rush to fill it. I don't. I folded my napkin, I looked at her carefully, then I asked one question. "Olivia, do you know who structured the purchase agreement on this condo?" She blinked. Chris went still. "Excuse me," she said. I smiled gently. "Just curious." She laughed it off. "Chris handled that. He's very capable." Capable. Yes, that's one word for it. Dinner ended shortly after. Chris walked me to the elevator. "Mom, she didn't mean it like that." "Mean what?" I asked calmly. He didn't answer. In the parking garage, I looked up at the building, glass and steel. Impressive. I drove home slowly. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I pulled out a folder labeled ELLISON structures, because here's what Olivia didn't know. And here's what Chris hoped I'd forgotten. 11 years ago, when Richard passed, Victor Langford helped me restructure several real estate holdings. We created a holding trust, layered ownership, quiet control. And 8 months ago, when Chris said he was purchasing that condo, he didn't technically lie. He just didn't explain who financed the entity that acquired it. I went to my office. I opened my laptop. I reviewed the trust documents, the wire transfers, the ownership percentages. My name didn't appear anywhere obvious. That was intentional. I made one phone call. "Victor," I said when he answered, "it's time." He paused only a second. "Do you want the full review?" "Yes." "All right," he replied. "Then we'll need to schedule a family meeting." I looked at the city lights outside my window. I thought about the way Olivia measured worth by visibility, the way Chris measured success by applause, the way I had quietly measured everything by risk exposure. They thought they were standing on their own foundation. They had no idea who poured it. The next morning, I received an automated notification from the trust portal. A scheduled refinancing discussion had been initiated by Chris, without my knowledge. That's when I realized this wasn't just pride, this was positioning. And positioning without full authority is dangerous. I didn't confront him, not yet, because when someone underestimates you publicly, you never correct them publicly. You let them continue, you let them feel secure, you let them talk. And then, when the time is right, you open the file. By the end of that week, Victor had uncovered something interesting. Something Chris assumed I would never review, something tied to equity reallocation. Something that would explain the Range Rover, the Napa trip, the new breathing room. I set a date for the family meeting. I told Chris it was about estate planning updates. Future grandchildren, asset clarity. He sounded relieved. Olivia sounded excited. She loves rooms where numbers are discussed. She just doesn't love rooms where she doesn't control them. The meeting is next Friday at 2:00 p.m., and by the time they walk out of that conference room, they'll understand something very clearly. Silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. And next week we open the file. Friday arrived dressed like any other quiet afternoon. No thunder, no dramatic music. Just a calm sky and the sound of my heels against polished marble as I walked into Victor Langford's office. If you've ever noticed how the biggest shifts in your life happen in ordinary rooms, stay with me. There's a reason calm people are the most dangerous ones to underestimate. Chris and Olivia arrived 5 minutes late, of course. Chris wore a navy suit that screamed promotion. Olivia stepped in like the hallway was a runway, cream blazer, gold hardware, hair sleek enough to reflect light. They looked successful. They looked unbothered. They looked completely unaware. "Mom," Chris said smoothly, leaning down to kiss my cheek. "You sounded serious on the phone." "Estate planning is serious," I replied gently. "It's time to review structure." I didn't elaborate. Silence gathers evidence. Victor gestured toward the conference table. "Let's begin." Olivia crossed her legs. "We're excited, actually. We've been thinking about long-term positioning too." Positioning, I almost smiled. That word again. Chris leaned back confidently. "I've been meaning to talk to you about liquidity, Mom. The house is underutilized capital. You're sitting on equity." There it was, not grief, not security, equity. "Am I?" I asked softly. Chris nodded. "Dad always believed in smart leverage. Keeping dead assets is emotional." He didn't notice the flicker in Victor's eyes. He didn't realize he had just stepped into a sentence that would matter later. Olivia added lightly, "And honestly, Mara, managing property at your age, it's a lot. You deserve simplicity." At your age, I folded my hands neatly. "You're concerned about my capacity?" "Concerned about efficiency," Olivia corrected with a polite smile. Chris cleared his throat. "We're not trying to push, but if you transferred the property now, we could refinance it under my development portfolio, protect it, grow it, protect it." I thought of Richard's voice 11 years ago at our kitchen table. "Protection isn't loud, Mara, it's layered." Victor opened a folder. "Before we discuss transfers, we should clarify current ownership." Chris looked mildly impatient. "It's straightforward. Dad left everything to Mom." Victor didn't answer immediately. He simply slid a document across the table. "Not everything," he said calmly. Olivia frowned. "What does that mean?" Victor adjusted his glasses. "The residence at 14 Westhaven Drive is not owned by Mrs. Ellison personally." Chris blinked. "Of course it is. It is owned by the Ellison Protective Trust," Victor continued, tone neutral. "Established in 2012. Silence. Chris leaned forward. "That's not possible. I've seen the deed." "You've seen a copy of the occupancy deed," Victor replied. "The underlying ownership is held by the trust. Mrs. Ellison is not the asset owner. She is the lifetime managing trustee." Olivia's expression shifted, not confusion, but calculation. So, what does that mean? Victor folded his hands. It means the property cannot be sold, leveraged, refinanced, or transferred without trust approval. Chris laughed lightly. Okay, fine, so Mom approves. Victor didn't smile. There is a second trustee. Chris's jaw tightened. Who? Victor looked directly at me before answering. Richard Ellison structured the trust with a cosign authority requirement. Any asset movement requires dual trustee approval. The room went still. And who is the co-trustee? Olivia asked carefully. Victor let the silence stretch half a second too long. Me, Chris straightened in his chair. You, yes, Victor's tone didn't change. And I do not authorize asset liquidation that destabilizes long-term security. The shift in Chris's posture was small, but I saw it. The charm slipped. Mom, Chris said slowly, why didn't you tell me about this? You never asked about structure, I replied gently. Only about equity. Olivia's voice sharpened slightly. So the house isn't really yours? I turned to her calmly. It is mine to live in, not mine to gamble. Victor added, the trust also includes a clause protecting Mrs. Ellison from coercion, undue influence, or financial manipulation. Chris's face flushed. Are you implying something? Victor met his eyes without emotion. I am stating the language written in 2012. I leaned back. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. This wasn't revenge. This was architecture. Chris exhaled sharply. This is ridiculous. Dad trusted me. Your father trusted structure, I said quietly. Olivia stood up. So what exactly are we doing here? Victor closed the first folder and opened another. We are reviewing additional provisions. Chris hesitated. Additional? Victor nodded. There is also a discretionary review clause triggered if a direct heir demonstrates financial instability, reputational risk exposure, or evidence of asset dependency. Chris stared at him. What are you talking about? Victor didn't blink. Over the past 18 months, Mr. Ellison, your debt ratio has increased 37%. 2 personal guarantees were filed under your development company. 1 lawsuit is pending. Chris went pale. Olivia turned toward him sharply. What lawsuit? I didn't react. Silence gathers evidence. Chris swallowed. It's just business exposure. Victor slid another document forward. The trust was structured to prevent inherited capital from being used to offset speculative leverage. The room felt smaller now. The confidence Chris walked in with had evaporated. Olivia's voice lowered. Mara, you investigated us? No, I replied softly. I prepared. Victor's final sentence landed without volume. As of this morning, the trust has been amended. Chris's head snapped up. Amended how? Victor's tone remained clinical. Future inheritance is suspended pending performance review and fiduciary evaluation. Silence exploded in the space between them. Suspended? Chris whispered. Yes, Victor replied. And until further notice, no capital access will be granted. Olivia slowly sat back down. So there's nothing to leverage, she murmured. I looked at my son, not with anger, not with punishment, but with clarity. There is something to inherit, I said calmly. Integrity. Chris didn't answer. He couldn't. Victor closed the folder. This meeting is concluded. Chris stood abruptly. This isn't over. I rose too, my posture unshaken. No, I said gently, it isn't. And as they walked out, Olivia glancing back once, not at me but at Victor, something shifted in the room. Not drama, not victory, just repositioning. Because what Chris didn't yet realize was that the amendment wasn't the final move. It was only the first layer. If you've ever watched someone smile while quietly calculating their next move, you already know this. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control. 3 days after the meeting at Victor Langford's office, Christopher Ellison showed up at my front door unannounced. Not angry, not shouting, calm, too calm. He was wearing jeans and a cashmere sweater, casual but curated, the image of a son coming to reconcile. I saw through presentation the way other people see through glass. Hi, Mom, he said softly. Can we talk? I stepped aside. Of course. Olivia didn't come, that detail mattered. Chris walked into the living room like he still owned future rights to it. He stood near the fireplace looking at the framed photograph of Richard Ellison. Dad would hate this tension, he said carefully. A test. I poured tea without answering. You blindsided me, Chris continued. Suspending inheritance. Bringing up my debt exposure in front of Olivia, I placed his cup in front of him. I did not suspend anything personally. The trust triggered review. Because of you, because of structure, Chris exhaled sharply. Mom, you know development works on leverage. Debt isn't instability, it's strategy. I tilted my head slightly. Strategy without insulation becomes collapse. He paced. That was new. Chris didn't pace. He usually leaned, controlled, polished. Olivia thinks you don't trust us, he said. Trust is not emotion, I replied calmly. Trust is documented behavior. That sentence landed. He didn't like it. So what now? He asked. You just sit on everything. Let it freeze. I folded my hands. The trust doesn't freeze assets, it filters risk. Chris looked at me like he was trying to recognize someone unfamiliar. You've changed. I didn't smile. No. I've stopped explaining. The silence that followed was not empty, it was weighted. Chris shifted tactics. Charm, Mom, I know you think I'm reckless, but everything I do is to build something bigger. Dad built stability. I'm building expansion. I looked toward Richard's photograph briefly. Your father built protection before expansion. Chris stopped pacing. So what do I need to do? That question mattered. It was the first honest one. I didn't answer immediately. Silence gathers evidence. You reduce exposure, I said finally. You eliminate personal guarantees. You increase liquidity without artificial inflation. You demonstrate sustainable growth without dependency. Chris blinked. You've been reviewing my filings. Public records exist for a reason. His jaw tightened. You don't think I can handle my own life? I think, I said gently, you're afraid of not outperforming your father. That hit deeper than any legal clause. Chris looked away. For a second the image cracked. You don't understand the pressure, he muttered. Appear strong, look successful, be impressive. My voice stayed even. Impressive to whom? He didn't answer, because we both knew Olivia, her circles. The rooms where perception outranked substance. He ran a hand through his hair. Olivia says legacy is relevance, that if you're not growing, you're fading. I leaned back. Growth without foundation is noise. He stared at me. You think she's the problem? No, I said quietly. Validation is the problem. The room went still. Chris's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, then silenced it. She's worried, he said defensively. About what? That the trust suspension makes us look unstable. There it was, not security, not ethics, optics. I nodded slowly. Appearances don't strengthen contracts. Chris suddenly looked tired, not polished, not executive. Just tired. Victor said something else in that meeting, he said carefully. He mentioned additional provisions. What didn't he say? I watched him closely. This was the moment. Your father didn't just structure property protection, I said. He structured behavior triggers. Chris's eyes narrowed. Meaning the trust reviews character, not just balance sheets. His expression hardened. So now I'm being graded, you're being observed. The word unsettled him more than accusation would have. He stood up. This feels like punishment. I rose as well, steady and composed. No, Christopher, punishment is emotional. This is insulation. He moved toward the door, then paused. If I fix the numbers, he asked quietly, does the trust reinstate? I met his eyes. If you fix the patterns, the numbers will follow. He opened the door. You really think I'm fragile? I think, I said softly, you're performing strength instead of building it. He left without another word. The house fell quiet again. I returned to my seat and stared at Richard's photograph. You saw it coming, didn't you? I whispered. I could almost hear his voice from years ago at our kitchen table. Leverage reveals character faster than crisis. My phone rang. Victor Langford. He came to you, Victor said calmly. Yes, and I walked toward the window. He asked what he needs to do. Victor paused. That's movement. It's awareness, I corrected. Not yet change. Victor's voice lowered slightly. There's something else you should know. I didn't react outwardly. Go on. Olivia scheduled a consultation with an outside attorney this morning. She's exploring trust contestation. Silence, not shock, just confirmation. On what grounds? I asked evenly. Undue influence, cognitive capacity review. I almost smiled. Predictable, Victor continued. They'll attempt to imply you were pressured into amendments. And they don't understand layered documentation. I looked at Richard's photo again. They never do. Victor's final words came measured. Be prepared, this won't stay quiet. I ended the call and stood still for a long moment. Then I whispered to the empty room, silence gathers evidence. What Chris and Olivia didn't know was that Richard hadn't just structured protection. He had structured consequence. And the next layer was already in motion. If someone questions your strength, don't argue, let documentation speak. 1 week after Victor warned me, I received the letter, thick cream envelope, formal. Intentional, a petition for trust review based on concerns regarding cognitive capacity and potential undue influence. I read it once, then again. My hands did not shake. At 72, I had survived audits, hostile board investigations, and corporate restructures. I did not panic over paper, I studied it. Silence gathers evidence. The petition was filed by an external attorney hired by Olivia Hart Ellison. The language was polished, careful. It didn't accuse directly, it implied. Recent behavioral shifts. Abrupt estate modifications. Isolation from immediate heirs, subtle. Strategic, I almost respected the attempt. Almost, I called Victor. It's begun, I said simply. Yes, he replied, as expected. They're challenging capacity. They're attempting leverage through optics, Victor corrected. But they underestimated preparation. I sat at my dining table, sunlight cutting across polished wood. Walk me through it. Victor's voice remained steady. Your cognitive evaluations from the past 5 years are documented. Your financial audits are clean. All amendments were executed in my office with 2 independent witnesses and video recording. There is 0 procedural vulnerability. I closed my eyes briefly. Richard's voice echoed from years ago, never sign anything without 2 layers of verification. I had listened. Victor continued, however, there is an additional layer they don't know about. My eyes opened. Which one? A pause. The behavioral trigger file. I didn't smile. You kept it separate. Of course. 3 days later, a mediation hearing was scheduled, not a courtroom, not yet. A formal review meeting to assess the validity of the trust amendments. Olivia arrived composed. Cream suit, minimal jewelry, professional. Chris walked in beside her, expression tight but controlled. I noticed something new, distance between them, not physical, subtle. Victor set his briefcase on the table and began organizing documents with surgical precision. The mediator, a retired judge, greeted us all evenly. We are here to determine whether Mrs. Ellison's recent trust amendment was executed under full capacity and without undue influence. Olivia spoke first. Calm, measured, we are concerned about sudden decisions that drastically alter inheritance expectations. My husband deserves clarity. Deserves. Victor's eyebrow barely moved. Chris added carefully, I just want to ensure my mother isn't being pressured. I folded my hands, I let them finish. Silence gathers evidence. The mediator turned to me. Mrs. Ellison, do you understand the amendment you signed? Completely, I replied. And did anyone coerce you? No. Victor slid a tablet across the table. With permission. He pressed play. The screen showed me sitting in Victor's office 3 weeks earlier. Clear, steady, articulating the amendment in my own words, explaining the reasoning, citing fiduciary clauses, even correcting a minor phrasing detail in the draft. The mediator watched carefully. Olivia's posture stiffened. Chris stared at the screen like he'd never seen his mother before. When the video ended, the mediator nodded slowly. This appears deliberate and informed. Olivia inhaled sharply. But why suspend inheritance entirely? Victor didn't answer. He opened a second folder. It was not suspended without cause. He slid documents forward, debt ratios, personal guarantee filings. A risk assessment analysis comparing Chris's exposure to trust preservation standards. Chris's face tightened. You pulled my filings? Public record, Victor replied evenly. The trust contains a protective clause requiring review if an heir demonstrates destabilizing financial behavior. Olivia turned toward Chris. You told me the guarantees were temporary. Chris didn't respond. The mediator leaned back. Mr. Ellison, were you aware of this clause? Chris hesitated. No, I spoke softly. Your father briefed you on it when you were 30. Chris's eyes flicked to me, memory surfaced. A conversation in Richard's office years ago, he had dismissed it then. Dad was overly cautious, he muttered. Victor's voice remained level. Caution built the structure you are attempting to access. Silence filled the room again. The mediator cleared his throat. Based on documentation and recorded evidence, there is no indication of cognitive impairment or undue influence. The amendment stands. Olivia's composure cracked for half a second, just enough. So that's it, she asked. For now, Victor replied. Chris looked at me, not angry, not defeated, something else, unsettled. You really prepared for this, he said quietly. I met his gaze. I prepared long before you needed it. The mediator closed his folder. Meeting concluded. Outside in the hallway, Olivia walked ahead without speaking. Chris lingered. Mom, he said low enough that only I could hear, did you ever plan to tell me about the behavioral trigger? I assumed you remembered. I didn't think you'd use it. I didn't think I'd need to, he nodded slowly. So what now? I looked straight ahead. Now you decide whether you want to inherit assets or earn alignment. He swallowed. And if I fail, I didn't soften. Then the trust reallocates. He stared at me. To who? Victor answered from behind us, voice calm and final. To purpose. Chris didn't understand yet, but he would. Because what neither he nor Olivia realized was that the trust didn't just protect property. It redirected legacy, and the next clause was not about money at all. Most people think inheritance is about money. It isn't. It's about alignment. And when alignment breaks, money just exposes it. 3 days after the mediation ruling, I received a call from Victor Langford. His voice, as always, carried no emotion. It's time, he said. I stood by the window looking out at the winter trees lining my street. For which layer? I asked. The character clause disclosure. I didn't hesitate. Schedule it. That evening, Christopher arrived alone again. Olivia had declined the invitation this time. That detail mattered more than she realized. Chris looked worn. Not physically, still tailored, still polished, but internally frayed. You said there was something else, he began. Something about reallocation. I gestured for him to sit. There is. Victor joined us via video call. No theatrics, just clarity. The Ellison Protective Trust contains a secondary directive drafted by Richard Ellison in 2012, Victor began. It activates under sustained behavioral misalignment. Chris exhaled sharply. Define misalignment. Victor didn't blink. Demonstrated pattern of ego-driven financial exposure, reputational prioritization over fiduciary responsibility, and external validation dependency. The room went still. Chris gave a tight laugh. That's subjective. It's documented, Victor corrected. Your father required 3 independent financial behavior assessments over a 10-year window. All 3 thresholds have now been met. Chris looked at me. You've been monitoring me for 10 years? No, I said calmly. Your father structured accountability. Victor continued. If the behavioral threshold is triggered and not corrected within a review period, 60% of discretionary inheritance reallocates to a designated impact initiative. Chris's jaw tightened. Impact initiative? I folded my hands. The Ellison Financial Ethics Fellowship. Silence. What is that? Chris asked. A foundation your father created, Victor replied. It funds graduate students studying ethical corporate governance and financial transparency. Chris stared at him. You're telling me most of my inheritance goes to a scholarship fund? Victor nodded once. If corrective benchmarks are not met within 18 months. The air in the room shifted. Chris stood up abruptly. So I'm being graded like some intern? I remained seated. You are being measured against the standards your father believed protected legacy. Legacy? Chris snapped. Dad never had to operate in this market. Things are different now. Optics matter. Integrity always matters, I replied softly. He ran a hand through his hair. You really think I'm reckless? Power looks impressive until it's tested in private. 2 months passed without drama, no legal letters, no formal disputes. On the surface, everything appeared stable. Christopher Ellison continued posting polished photos from development site visits. Ribbon cuttings, strategic partnerships, carefully worded captions about vision and growth. Olivia Hart Ellison curated lifestyle spreads that blended soft lighting with sharper ambition, charity galas, luxury brunches, women in leadership panels. To the outside world, nothing had shifted. But I understood something most people don't. Silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it means recalibration. One Tuesday afternoon, Victor called. There's movement, he said simply. I set my teacup down. Explain. Christopher has begun dissolving 2 personal guarantees. That's significant. I didn't smile. Pressure works. Not pressure, Victor corrected. Consequence. That evening, Chris showed up again, no suit. No polish, just a plain button-down and visible fatigue. I sold the Galleria project, he said before sitting down. I waited. It was over-leveraged, he admitted. Dad would have hated it. There it was, the comparison. Always the comparison. I spoke evenly. You don't need to outperform your father, you need to outgrow insecurity. He let out a dry laugh. You think that's what this is? I think you built an image faster than you built insulation. Chris rubbed his forehead. Olivia says scaling back makes us look unstable. I held his gaze. Stability isn't loud. The room went quiet. He hesitated before speaking again. She doesn't understand why I'm pulling back. Does she know about the benchmarks? I asked. He shook his head. I didn't tell her everything. Silence gathers evidence. Why? I pressed gently. Because if she knew most of my inheritance was conditional, she'd panic. I absorbed that carefully. So you're managing perception at home too? He didn't deny it. A week later, the shift became visible. Olivia posted fewer extravagant outings. The high-profile events slowed, subtle but noticeable. Instead of Paris-inspired dinners, there were curated strategy retreats. Instead of luxury brand showcases, she pivoted to authentic leadership content. Rebranding. I saw it for what it was: adaptation under pressure. But adaptation is not transformation. Then came the fracture. One evening, Chris arrived unannounced. His composure was thinner this time. She hired another consultant, he said flatly. I looked up. For what? To assess the trust from a reputational standpoint. She wants to spin the narrative if reallocation happens. I didn't flinch. So she's preparing optics. She says we can't look like we lost control of family assets. There it was again. Control, not integrity, control. And what do you want? I asked quietly. Chris sat down heavily. I want to stop living like I'm auditioning. That sentence lingered. For the first time, there was no charm, no distraction, just truth. I leaned forward slightly, then stop. He shook his head. It's not that simple. It is, I replied. It's not easy, but it is simple. He stared at the floor. She doesn't see why I'm scaling back deals. She thinks I'm losing edge. My voice remained calm. Edge without anchor cuts the wrong person. He exhaled slowly. You're not angry at me. Anger wastes clarity, I said. I prefer alignment. Another silence, this one less tense. Chris looked up. If I meet the benchmarks, do you think Dad would have respected that? I allowed myself the smallest softness in my expression. Your father respected correction more than perfection. That stayed with him. Days later, Victor sent an update. Christopher has enrolled in the compliance certification program, he said, and reduced unsecured exposure by 22% already. I nodded. And Olivia? Victor paused. She's less enthusiastic. Not evil, just validation-driven. I understood that. When identity is built on appearance, contraction feels like erasure. But legacy isn't built on applause, it's built on endurance. 2 weeks later, the confrontation finally surfaced. Chris arrived again, but this time the tension was sharper. She found out, he said. I didn't need clarification. And she thinks you're manipulating me. Silence. Are you? He asked suddenly. I met his eyes steadily. No. He searched my face for any flicker of deception. There was none. She says I'm choosing your approval over ours. I responded carefully. I am not competing with your marriage. He ran a hand through his hair. She thinks the fellowship clause is a humiliation tactic. It's a protection tactic, I corrected. There's a difference. Chris stood, pacing now, a familiar sign of inner conflict. If I let the fellowship take majority control, she'll see it as weakness. Or strength, I replied, depending on the lens. He stopped. You don't care if the money goes to the foundation. The money was never the point, I said. The alignment was. The air shifted again, not explosive, just revealing. Chris looked exhausted. I don't know if she'll stay if I choose correction over expansion. My voice softened, not fragile but human. Then you'll discover whether she married your ambition or your integrity. That sentence lingered long after he left. That night, I stood in front of Richard's photograph. You always said leverage reveals character, I murmured. Now it's revealing marriage. My phone buzzed, a short message from Victor. Be prepared. If their internal alignment fractures, the trust will accelerate. I set the phone down slowly, because the next 18 months were no longer just about financial benchmarks. They were about loyalty, ego, and identity. And sometimes, when pressure is applied long enough, the image doesn't just crack, it splits. Pressure doesn't just test character, it exposes what was never solid to begin with. 9 months into the 18-month benchmark window, the fracture finally became visible. Not on social media, not in public filings, at home. Christopher arrived at my house on a Sunday morning. No appointment, no performance, just silence in his posture. He didn't sit right away. He stood in the center of the living room like someone measuring the weight of a decision. "She moved out," he said quietly. I didn't react outwardly. I simply waited. Silence gathers evidence. "Temporary," he added. "She says she needs space." I nodded once. "And what do you need?" He gave a hollow laugh. "I don't know anymore." He finally sat down. "When I cut the Riverside project, she called it surrender. When I sold the second property, she said I was shrinking. When I enrolled in the compliance program, she asked if I was trying to impress you." My voice remained even. "Were you?" He looked at me directly. "No," that was the first clean answer in months. "Then why are you doing it?" I asked gently. Chris leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Because I was tired of pretending risk was confidence." That sentence hung in the air. I felt something shift, not victory, not satisfaction, just recognition. Growth rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up in quiet admissions. "Victor sent me the quarterly report," I said calmly. "Your unsecured debt is down 60%. He nodded. 80 by next month. "And the personal guarantees? All dissolved except one that closes in 30 days. I studied him carefully. The polish was still there, but thinner. "Less armor, and the ethics certification, completed last week." He paused. "With distinction." I allowed myself the smallest nod of acknowledgement. "Your father would have respected that," Chris swallowed. "Olivia said distinction doesn't trend." I didn't respond immediately. When I did, my voice was steady. "Trending fades, structure endures." He sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "If the trust reallocates, I won't contest it." I looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because for the first time, I understand why he built it that way." Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was grounded. 2 weeks later, Victor requested a formal review meeting. This one was different from the others. No mediation, no challenge, just evaluation. We gathered in Victor's office, me, Chris, and Victor. Olivia was not present. Victor reviewed the documentation with methodical precision. Debt reduction verified, personal guarantees dissolved, compliance certification authenticated, public reputation stabilized. Then he closed the folder. "There is one final assessment," Victor said calmly. Chris nodded. "I assumed there would be." Victor looked at him directly. "Why did you pursue correction?" Chris didn't rush the answer. He didn't charm it. He didn't polish it. "Because I realized I was building something that required applause to survive." Victor's gaze didn't soften, but it sharpened with approval. "And now I'm building something that survives without it." I felt Richard's presence in that moment, not physically, but structurally. The foundation he built was working exactly as designed. Victor folded his hands. "The board has reached a conclusion." Silence. Chris didn't move, I didn't either. Victor delivered the sentence the way only he could, measured, final, clean. "The Ellison Protective Trust will reinstate full inheritance structure under progressive release conditions." Chris exhaled slowly, not relief, not triumph, just release. Victor continued, "However, the fellowship clause remains active at 20% allocation permanently." Chris blinked once. "Permanently?" "Yes," Victor said calmly. "Your father intended legacy to serve beyond bloodline." Chris nodded slowly. "That's fair." I studied him carefully, no anger, no resistance, just acceptance. Victor added one final sentence. "And should destabilizing patterns reappear, acceleration triggers remain in place." Chris allowed himself the faintest smile. "Understood." After the meeting, Chris and I walked outside together. The air was crisp, quiet. "She won't come back," he said softly. I didn't offer comfort. I offered clarity. "Some people love expansion more than evolution." He nodded. "I don't blame her." "Blame wastes time," I replied. "Reflection builds it." He looked at me not as someone guarding an inheritance, but as someone recognizing architecture. You didn't fight me, he said. You didn't shame me. I insulated you, I corrected. That stayed with him. As he walked to his car, he paused. Mom, I looked at him. Thank you for not reacting. My voice was steady, almost gentle. Reaction breaks leverage, he left quietly. I stood there for a moment, watching the street settle back into stillness. Later that evening, I stood in front of Richard's photograph again. He chose structure, I whispered. Not applause. My phone buzzed. A short message from Victor. Legacy secured. I set the phone down because what Chris finally understood, what Olivia never could, was this. Inheritance isn't about who demands it loudest. It's about who can carry it without collapsing. And the final layer wasn't about money at all. It was about identity. Legacy doesn't end with applause, it ends with alignment. 1 year after the first mediation meeting, the Ellison house was quieter than it had ever been. Not empty. Not lonely, just steady. Christopher Ellison had completed every benchmark, debt reduced, guarantees dissolved, exposure stabilized, the fellowship funded, the structure restored. Olivia Hart Ellison did not return. The separation became formal 3 months after the trust reinstatement. There was no public scandal, no dramatic social posts, just a carefully worded statement about diverging visions. I did not comment. Silence gathers evidence. On a clear Thursday afternoon, Victor Langford requested one final meeting. Not about correction, not about risk, about closure. We sat in the same conference room where everything had shifted months ago. I sat at one end, Chris across from me, Victor between us, as always, neutral, precise. Victor opened a thin folder this time, no stacks, no tension. Today's session is administrative, he said calmly. Final confirmation of structural status. Chris nodded. He looked different now, still polished but not performing. There was no edge in his posture, no restless pacing, just grounded stillness. Victor reviewed the summary. Debt exposure within acceptable range, liquidity stabilized, compliance program completed and renewed, public filings clear. He paused, then delivered it. Full inheritance access reinstated under monitored release schedule. Fellowship allocation fixed at 20% in perpetuity. Chris didn't flinch. Understood. Victor closed the folder. There is one final clause to acknowledge. My eyes didn't move. I already knew which one. Victor looked directly at Chris. If Mrs. Ellison determines that relational manipulation, reputational coercion, or financial dependency tactics reemerge, discretionary authority allows her to redirect majority allocation without further mediation. Silence. Chris didn't argue, he didn't defend, he simply nodded. Fair, Victor stood, then my work here is complete. He paused before leaving the room and delivered the kind of sentence only he could. Structure is mercy when used correctly. And then he walked out. The room felt different without him, not tense, just honest. Chris looked at his mother, really looked at me. You never yelled at me, he said quietly. I folded my hands. Yelling is reaction. You never tried to shame me. Shame is emotional leverage, I replied. It doesn't build endurance. He swallowed. Why didn't you just cut me off? I took a breath, not heavy, just reflective. Because your father didn't build walls, he built consequences. That landed. Chris leaned forward slightly. I used to think Dad was rigid. I allowed the smallest hint of a smile. He was protective. Chris looked around the conference room slowly. I thought inheritance meant access. My voice remained steady. Inheritance means responsibility. A long silence followed, but this one felt complete. Olivia said you were controlling, Chris admitted. I didn't react. Was I? He asked. I met his eyes directly. No, I was prepared. That was the truth, and he felt it. He stood up slowly, not in frustration, in acknowledgement. I don't know if I would have survived without the trust forcing me to stop. I rose too. You would have survived, I said calmly. You just might not have recognized yourself. He stepped closer, not to hug, not for performance. Just proximity. You were right about one thing. Which one? I was auditioning. I nodded. For rooms that would never protect you. He exhaled slowly. I'm done auditioning. I didn't celebrate it, I simply accepted it. Because growth doesn't need applause, it needs consistency. Later that evening, I stood alone in my living room. Richard Ellison's photograph still rested on the mantel. He chose identity, I said softly. Over image. The house felt peaceful, not triumphant, not dramatic, just aligned. My phone buzzed, a message from Victor, one sentence. Legacy secured permanently. I set the phone down and turned off the lamp. Because this was never about punishing a son. It was about protecting a name. It was never about control. It was about insulation. It was never about money. It was about character. And if you're listening to this, if you've ever felt pressured to hand over what you built just to keep the peace, remember this. Silence is not weakness. Preparation is not cruelty. Structure is not control. Sometimes the most powerful sentence you'll ever speak is the one you don't raise your voice to say. And that was how I ended it. Not with a fight, not with revenge, but with one quiet truth: legacy chooses who can carry it.